Good evening. Thankful for the opportunity to be up here. I'm glad this time I could. The last couple of opportunities I had to speak, I had to decline because of work commitments, but actually I have to work tonight when I leave here, but it's just a 4-hour shift. I think I can probably power through that, but it's good to be up here and to speak tonight. Speaking of work, on my way to work, I spend a lot of time in my car. I got an hour-and-a-half commute both ways, and I search out things to listen to while I'm driving, and one of the things I've come across recently is audiobooks. And I listened to one, I don't know, it's probably been a month or so now, and I really enjoyed it, and I would recommend it. It's got some compelling stuff in it, and it's called The Case for Christ. Maybe some of you have heard of that. Maybe you've seen the movie. It's a book written by Lee Strobel. Lee Strobel was an investigative journalist. He's got a degree in that. He also has a law degree from Yale University. He was also an atheist. And early on in his marriage, his wife decided to become a Christian. Now, I use the term Christian loosely. She's, I would say, denominational, but we'll call it Christian. Anyway, she converted to Christianity, and he didn't like that because of his atheism. And he self-professed that he was selfish, and he didn't want her Christianity to interrupt his social life or his business life, his career. So he thought he would take his investigative journalism expertise, that he would go over the evidence for Christianity and the claims of the Bible in order to disprove them. He was going to take all the evidence he could about the claims of Jesus, put them under rigorous he would investigate them, and he thought at the end of his investigation he would come to the conclusion or prove that Christianity was not true, that Jesus was not who he said he was. But he agreed to go into it with an honest and open mind and let the evidence lead him where it would. And at the end of his investigation, it took 2 years, and he would treat the evidence like you would evidence in a court case. He subjected it to the corroborating evidence test, archaeological test, fingerprint test, eyewitness test. He took all the evidence and put it through these tests to see if Jesus' claims were true. And at the end of the 2 years, he interviewed several different experts, such as William Lane Craig, J.P. Moreland, Gary Habermas. All these guys are experts in New Testament Christianity, the resurrection, the death of Jesus, the empty tomb. He interviewed these guys, and at the end of the 2 years, he looked at the information that he had acquired. He sat down with an open mind and went over the evidence that he had acquired and put through the test, and he came to the conclusion that the only conclusion he could come to using reason and logic was that Jesus was exactly who he claimed he was, and he became a Christian. And he wrote the book, The Case for Christ. And if you read that book, it's got several chapters. Each chapter is how he put the evidence through the ringer of, as he would a court case. One of the most probably influential or one that maybe caused me to think the most out of the book was I think it was chapter 14 called The Circumstantial Evidence for the Resurrection. So we'll talk about that tonight. First, we need to discuss two types of evidence. First, we have direct evidence. And an example of that would be a confession or an eyewitness testimony. Let's say that I walk up to Tim's house on his porch. He comes out to confront me, and I shoot him with a .38 caliber gun. I go into his house and take his TV, and I go pawn it for money. Now, someone sees a red truck leaving the scene. They see a man in a blue jacket and a black hat, and they see him carry the TV off. I'm pulled over by the police in a red truck, and they ask me about the crime, and I confess to it and say, yes, about 9:15, I went to Tim's house. I was wearing a blue jacket, a black hat. I was driving a red truck. I shot him with a .38 caliber gun, and I took his TV and pawned it. Now, that's a confession. That's direct evidence coming directly from me who committed the crime. Pretty compelling stuff. But there's also eyewitness testimony where people under oath, you may have multiple eyewitnesses, see me pull up in Tim's yard in a red truck about 9:15, wearing a blue jacket and a black hat. They see me shoot him with a gun. They see me go into his house, get his TV, and leave. And under oath, they say this in front of a jury and judge. And that's pretty compelling evidence too. But it is subject to people's faded memory, prejudice, or fabrication. Somebody might just make the story up. So that's the examples of direct evidence. confession and eyewitness testimony. But a second kind of evidence is called circumstantial evidence. And I like to watch legal shows like The First 48 or stuff like that, where they say, we don't have a confession, we don't have an eyewitness, but we have found circumstantial evidence. And I wrongly thought that circumstantial evidence meant they had less important evidence or less compelling evidence, but that's not true at all. I was wrong about that. Circumstantial evidence is indirect evidence. What it is an accumulation of indirect evidence through which an inference can be drawn. An inference is just a conclusion you can come to through evidence and reasoning. So circumstantial evidence, an example of that would be, so Tim is found dead on his porch. He's been shot. Nobody saw me commit the crime. Somebody did see someone fleeing the crime in a red truck wearing a blue jacket and a black hat. So they call the police and say, hey, I just saw a man fleeing the scene of a crime. He's wearing a blue jacket and a black hat. He's driving a red truck. So the police within a 10-mile radius start pulling over red trucks. And they pull me over in a red truck. They pull me over and I'm wearing a blue jacket and a black hat. I fit the description. I got blood on my jacket. I'm seen on a videotape in a pawn shop carrying in a 50-inch TV and pawning it. I have a .38 caliber gun on me, which matches the caliber of the gun that killed Tim. They look at my phone records, look at the GPS coordinates. At about 9:15, I was at Tim's house. Now, nobody saw me commit the crime. When you take all these sets of facts and put them together and accumulate them, you start to see that I'm probably guilty, right? It's very strong evidence. It's indirect evidence, but when you put it all together, it's compelling. Now, maybe one piece of evidence wouldn't be enough. Say they pull me over in a red truck. Well, that doesn't mean I'm guilty. Lots of people have red trucks. Maybe they pull me over or see me in a store and I'm wearing a blue jacket and a black hat. Well, lots of people have those things. That doesn't prove that I'm guilty. But when you pile all the facts together, that I'm in a red truck, that I'm wearing a blue jacket and a black hat, that I have a .38 caliber, that I have Tim's blood on my jacket, when you put all those together, you have a pretty airtight case. So circumstantial evidence is plural or cumulative. It's a set of facts that prove another fact. It's evidence. So evidence is left behind in crime scenes. Rarely is there a crime committed where there's not some kind of circumstantial evidence left behind. And prosecutors can grab this, put it together. You know, sometimes you see on TV, they'll have some evidence like video camera, or he was pulled over in a red truck, or he's wearing the same type of clothes as the perpetrator, but they only have one piece of evidence, and it's not strong enough for them to charge the person with the crime. But when you accumulate multiple pieces of circumstantial evidence, you can draw a rational conclusion that someone is guilty or innocent. So what about a historical event like the resurrection of Christ, something that monumental? Will we expect there to be evidence left behind, circumstantial, indirect evidence to prove that the resurrection did happen? Would there be indirect evidence? Would there be a set of facts that point to the fact that he was resurrected? Well, the good news is there is. That's what I want to look at tonight. Some circumstantial evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. A set of facts, a set of indirect evidences, multiple evidences, that point to the fact that Jesus was resurrected. Now, he lists 5 in his book. I'm just going to go over 3 for the sake of time. Some of these you've probably heard before. We've talked about here before, but others you might not have thought about before. And I found it very compelling the more I think about these things over the last couple of weeks. This is really strong evidence. Number 1, the first piece of circumstantial evidence for the resurrection of Christ would be the changed lives of the apostles and their willingness to die for their conviction that Jesus rose from the dead. So imagine you're an apostle in the first century. You have profession, you have family, you have some of them had businesses. You leave all this behind to follow a man who says he's the Son of God, who says he's the Messiah. You see him do all these wonderful miracles. You believe he's the Son of God. You believe he's the Messiah. And then he's put to death, just like anybody else. What would that do to your confidence in him? What would that do to your belief in him? What would your disposition be like? Well, the Bible gives us some insight to the disposition or the attitudes and mindset of the apostles immediately after Jesus' death. Let's look at Matthew 26, verse 56. It says, "But all this was done that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. Then all the disciples forsook him and fled." So first off, we see the night Jesus was arrested, all the apostles were with him. What did they do when the authorities showed up to arrest Jesus? They left him alone. They scattered. They took off. They were worried about their own hide, right? They fled. After this man, they followed for 3 years and saw his miracles, listened to his teaching, saw the evidence, saw the proof that he was who he said he was. When he was being arrested, they fled. So they were afraid. Also in John 20, verse 19, we see, no? I got it right here.
There we go. I got it.
Okay. This is after Jesus' death, and Mary went to the tomb and found it empty. She comes back to the apostles, and it says, then the same day at evening, being the first day of the week, when the doors were shut, where the disciples were assembled. Why were the doors shut? For fear of the Jews. Jesus came and stood in the midst and said to them, peace be with you. So we see him meeting behind locked doors because they were afraid of the Jews. Why were they afraid of the Jews? Well, these guys were Jesus' closest companions. They were going about teaching the same things Jesus was teaching. I guess they feared their fate would be the same as Jesus's. So we see him, number one, we see him afraid. Number two, we see him sad. Mark 16, verses 10 through 11. This is Mary. She went to the disciples and said, she went and told those who had been with him as they mourned and wept. And when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they did not believe. So we see that they were weeping and they were mourning because Jesus had been crucified and he was dead. We also see that they did not believe the reports that he had been resurrected. And lastly, we see that they were discouraged and without hope. Remember the two men walking on the road to Emmaus, and Jesus joins them as they're walking. This is the day he was resurrected. Look in Luke 24, 17 through 21. Remember they were walking, and Jesus comes up beside them, but they didn't recognize who he was, and he said to them, what kind of conversation is this that you have with one another as you walk and are sad? Then the one whose name was Cleopas answered and said to him, are you the only stranger in Jerusalem? And have you not known the things which happened there in these days? And he said to them, what things? So they said to him, the things concerning Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him to be condemned to death and crucified him. But look at this next line. But we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. So they lost their hope. They had hoped he was the Messiah. They had hoped he was the one who redeemed Israel. But after his death, it seemed like they lost that hope. So they were scared. They were sad. They didn't believe he was resurrected, and they had lost all hope. This was their disposition immediately after Jesus' death. What caused this disposition? Well, think about what the Jews believed. Jews believed anyone hung on a tree and suffering a humiliating death was cursed by God. Deuteronomy 21, verse 22 and 23 says, if a man has committed a sin deserving of death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain overnight on the tree, but you shall surely bury him that day, so that you do not defile the land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, for he who is hanged is accursed of God. So this man they've been following around for 3 years and saying he's the Messiah and the Son of God suffers the most humiliating death, a death that was worthy for someone they believed was cursed by God. So this man they thought was the Messiah, they now maybe had the idea he was cursed by God. What else would cause this disposition of fear and sadness and loss of hope? Well, they thought their Messiah would be a conquering king. If he'd be in the line of David, he would come and restore Israel and restore peace by overthrowing the oppressors, not to be killed by the oppressors like Jesus was. So what did this do to their mindset? They thought this guy was the Messiah. He's hung upon a cross and suffered a humiliating death, the most humiliating death you can think of, a death that was for those who were cursed by God. And instead of the Messiah being one who would conquer their oppressors, he was killed by them. So what we think if we were in their shoes? This man we followed for 3 years and invested our lives in, our hope and beliefs in, is put to death just like any other human being. The movement would be over, wouldn't it? That's kind of the mindset we see in these guys. They lost hope, they were sad, and they were afraid. But look at their disposition just a couple days after Jesus died. We see these same men regroup and commit themselves to a very specific message. That message was that he was the Messiah of God, he died and was raised by God from the dead, and they had seen him. Why would they be committed to this message and spreading this message if it wasn't true? From a human point of view, What do they have to gain? Do they have riches awaiting them, political power? Do they have a mansion on the Mediterranean Sea awaiting them? No, they would suffer the same persecution Jesus did. They had nothing to gain and everything to lose by promoting this if it was a hoax. Think about what they faced for the rest of their lives for their teachings. They faced ridicule, imprisonment, beatings, and eventually most of them suffered torturous execution. So what are we to believe about this? Why did they willingly go through this? Would someone go through this if it was a hoax, something they knew to not be true? What would you do if there was a man here that we followed for 3 years and we thought he was the Messiah, the Son of God? We believed in his teachings, we believed he was who he claimed to be, and then he died just like anybody else. What would that do to your confidence in him and your belief in him? What if we all got together, 11 of us, and said, okay, he died, but we're going to go on. We're going to make up this lie that he's still alive, he's been resurrected, and that he's the Messiah. How long before one of us faced ridicule before one of us gave up the hoax? How long before one of us faced imprisonment before we gave up the hoax and said, oh, we made it up, don't put me in prison? How long before one of us was threatened with a beating before one of us claimed that it was a hoax or revealed that it was a hoax? Or how long before one of us was faced with execution before we would give up the hoax? So how do you adequately explain that these 11 men, 11 credible men, who had lost all hope, were sad, and were scared after Jesus' execution, how do you explain their complete turnaround to being bold and going out and preaching that Jesus was resurrection? Is there any adequate explanation? Well, Peter tells us in Acts 2:32 what caused that change. He said, this Jesus God has raised up, of which we are all witnesses. Paul also affirms this in 1 Corinthians 15:5 when he said he appeared to the 12. This is the only adequate explanation to why these 11 men, with nothing to gain and everything to lose, would face the life they faced following the teachings of Jesus and preaching the message that he was the Messiah and that he was raised from the dead. They were willing to face it and go through it because they knew it to be true. That's the only reasonable explanation or conclusion to come to. So that's the first piece of indirect evidence or consequential evidence. The changed lives of the apostles and their willingness to die for their conviction that he rose from the dead. Second piece, how about the conversion of skeptics? Now, there were some who didn't believe in Jesus before his death, but became believers after. Jesus had a family. He had some brothers, of which James was one. James was the brother of Jesus. Look at Matthew 13:55. That tells us this. Is this not the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary, and his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? James was the brother of Jesus. He, along with his other brothers and the rest of his family, did not believe the claims of Jesus or the reports about Jesus. Let's look at John 7, verses 2 through 5. Now the Jews' feast of tabernacles was at hand. His brothers therefore said to him, depart from here and go into Judea, that your disciples, they didn't consider themselves disciples, but your disciples also may see the works that you are doing. For no one does anything in secret while he himself seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world, for even his brothers did not believe in him. So his brothers, including James, did not believe in his reports or his claims or the reports about him. And this one I really found interesting. They were also embarrassed by him. Let's look at Mark 3:20 through 21. This is when Jesus chose the 12 apostles and came back down from the mountain. It says, a multitude came together again so that they could not so much as eat bread. But when his own people heard about this, they went out to lay hold of him, for they said, he is out of his mind. Now this is what his family thought about him. They thought he was out of his mind. They thought he was crazy. They thought they needed to go take him away from these people for their well-being as well as his. He's going around telling the world that he's the Messiah and the Son of God. All these people are coming to him and following him, and embarrassed his family because they didn't believe he was who he said he was. But after Jesus' death, where do we find James and his brothers? We find them with those same disciples that they were telling him to go up to and show himself to. Look at Acts 1, verses 13 through 14. And when they had entered, they went up to the upper room where they were staying. This is after Jesus' death. This is the day of Pentecost. Peter, James, John, and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon the Zealot, and Judas the son of James. These all continued with one accord in prayer and supplication with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and with his brothers. So shortly after his death, we see these same brothers who thought he was crazy, who didn't believe his claims or the reports about him. We see him with the disciples. So James was with the disciples after Jesus' death. We also, in Acts chapter 15, when Paul and Barnabas went up to the Jerusalem council, and Peter went up too to tell them about the conversion of the first Gentile, it says there was a gathering of the apostles and the elders, and one that's mentioned specifically in that chapter is James. He gives his judgment about this conversion of the first Gentile. So we see James being with the disciples, we see him with the apostles and elders, and Paul said in Galatians 2:9 that James was perceived as a pillar of the church. So James, the brother of Jesus, who didn't believe his claims, didn't believe the reports about him, about the miracles, about his claims to be Messiah or the Son of God, who thought he had to go rescue Jesus and rescue the people from Jesus because they thought he was out of his mind. Shortly after Jesus' death, we see him with the disciples, with the apostles and elders, and being seen as a pillar in the church. And Josephus writes that James eventually suffered martyrdom by being stoned to death for his beliefs. Why the change in James? What kind of event would cause James to change course so dramatically from non-believer and skeptic to a pillar in the church? What would it take for you? What would it take for me? If my brother went around telling everybody he's the Messiah and he's the Son of God and I didn't believe it, and then he's put to death, what would that do? Well, that would just confirm my belief. See, I told you, he's just another man. He's not the Messiah. He's not the Son of God. He's put to death just like you and me. What would change my mind? Well, Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 that he appeared to Cephas, he appeared to the 12, appeared to 500 brethren, and he appeared to James. Would that change your mind if you saw your brother who you knew was murdered, executed, crucified, if you saw him alive again? I think that's the only adequate explanation as to why James made the change from skeptic to pillar of the church. What about Paul? Another skeptic. In his own words in Galatians 1:13 through 15, Paul says, I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries in my own nation, being more exceedingly zealous for the traditions of my fathers. But when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me through his grace, should have been more of that. I'm sorry. Next verse. But anyway, he claims to have persecuted the church, and it says he tried to destroy it. So Paul wasn't just nonchalant about Christianity. He saw it as blasphemy and heresy. It interfered with the traditions of his fathers, the Jews had long held. He didn't turn a blind eye to it. He worked out his frustrations by going and arresting Christians and consenting to their death. He tried to destroy Christianity. But in the short time after Jesus' death, he went from not just letting up on persecution or giving the Christians a break. He went against everything he was taught in his upbringing. He went against his religious beliefs. He gave up his prominent position in Judaism to join them, become their chief proponent, evangelize Gentiles, and write majority of the New Testament. Now, what would cause a shift in a man like this, who was so adamantly against Christianity and Jesus and saw it as heresy, to become the biggest proponent and author of most of the books in the New Testament? What kind of event would cause a man to do this? What happened between Jesus' death and these men's conversions that made them believe? What's an adequate explanation for these men's conversions? What would it take for you? What would it take for you to change your course from being a skeptic or a persecutor of the church to a pillar of the church and an apostle? It would take something very significant, and Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15, 5 through 8, once again. He appeared to Cephas, he appeared to the 12, he appeared to the 500, he appeared to James, and last of all, he appeared to me, Paul. That's the kind of event, the only kind of event that adequately explains why men who were such hardened skeptics would convert to Christianity. So that's the second piece of indirect or circumstantial evidence. You have the changed lives of the apostles and their willingness to die for their convictions. You have the conversion of skeptics. And the last one, you have changes to key social and religious institutions in the first century. The Jews had several rituals and institutions. Their social norms and their religious institutions or social institutions were kind of intertwined. They had very strong beliefs, and these beliefs, institutions, and rituals were key to keeping their identity through periods of being conquered. What made the Jews Jews, they held on to and passed down from generation to generation to generation. It kept their identity. They didn't want to be assimilated into pagan nations. We still have Jews today, but we don't have Babylonians, Perizzites, Amorites. What happened to all these people? Well, they were conquered, married, assimilated, but the Jews held on to their identity. They had beliefs and practices and traditions that they passed down to the next generation and to the next and to the next. These beliefs and religious beliefs were celebrated and reinforced by their rituals. Why? Well, it kept their national identity, so they didn't want to be assimilated into the pagan cultures. It's what made Jews Jews. They didn't want to lose that. They believed these beliefs, rituals, and institutions, most importantly, were entrusted to them by God himself. What was at risk if they abandoned them? Their soul, right? God had given this law, God had given these commandments. They were entrusted by God to keep these things, and if they abandoned these things, it would cost them their soul. This was their belief and their traditions. Their traditions went back centuries, and they held on to them very strongly. And then Jesus appears, a carpenter from Nazareth. He teaches for 3 years. He makes claims about being the Messiah and the Son of God. He gathers a following of lower middle class people. He upsets authorities, and he's crucified by the Romans. Yet, shortly after his death, we see multitudes of Jews give up these social and religious institutions that they have been taught since childhood and follow him. Let's look at five quick institutions or rituals or beliefs or practices they gave up to follow Jesus after Jesus' death. Number one, they gave yearly animal sacrifices, right, for atonement of their sins. But after Jesus' death, we no longer see these Jews who become Christians offer animal sacrifices. Now, what was at stake if they were wrong? How would they be atoned? They're no longer offering the sacrifices for their atonement. They no longer kept the law of Moses and the traditions of their fathers to be a citizen in good standing and to be right with God. It's what separated them from pagans. The law was given to them by God. It separated them from pagan nations. But after Jesus' death, we no longer see the first century Jews keeping the law and traditions as before, but they were taught there was a new covenant. How about keeping the Sabbath? To be in right standing with God for over 1,500 years, they observed keeping the Sabbath because God had commanded it. But abruptly, after Jesus' death, they're worshiping on Sunday, the first day of the week, the day he arose. Number 4, monotheism. For centuries, they believed in one God, right? Yahweh, Jehovah, the God of Israel. No one, they thought, could be God and man. They thought that was blasphemy. Jesus comes along teaching them and proclaiming that he is God on earth, the Son of God, equal with God. But yet, shortly after Jesus' death, they're worshiping Jesus as God. They see the God as Trinity. They see God as Father, Holy Spirit, and most importantly, the Son. They elevated Jesus to deity, to God, to be worshiped. And lastly, the beliefs about the Messiah. They believed the Messiah would come. He'd be a conquering hero like David. He would restore Israel, rebuild the temple, restore peace, and overthrow their oppressors. Not one who would come, who would suffer and die for their sins. But shortly after Jesus' death, this is exactly what they believe and what they're teaching. So these 5 institutions or practices, they gave up these beliefs at the cost of their souls, right? They had believed for centuries that they were following the law of God, and if they didn't, it would cost them their soul. But they give all this up to follow Jesus and his teachings. How do you explain this? What caused these people, shortly after Jesus' death, not just one person, but thousands of people, to give these things up to follow Jesus these things had served them for centuries, and they believed they risked their soul if they were wrong. So why would they take the risk to worship Jesus and to follow his commandments? So conclusion. We got three pieces of indirect evidence or circumstantial evidence. You have the changed lives of the apostles and their willingness to die for their conviction. You have men who are hardened skeptics like James and Paul, who abruptly after Jesus' death become pillars of the church, elders, apostles. And you have Jews who for centuries believed in these religious rituals, traditions, and institutions and beliefs about God, and they gave them up. This is three pieces of indirect evidence. Remember, indirect evidence or circumstantial evidence is strong when you have multiple pieces of evidence. I just gave you three. In his book, Lee Strobel mentions two more. The emergence of baptism and the Lord's Supper, and also the emergence and spread of the church in the first century through the Roman Empire and eventually to the whole world. And you have to account for these things. Those three things I just mentioned are not in dispute, not even by skeptic biblical scholars. Nobody doubts the apostles were with Jesus, that they were afraid, sad, discouraged at his death, and later went on to commit their lives to teaching about his death, burial, and resurrection. Nobody disputes that James and Paul were once skeptics and then were converted. No one disputes that thousands of Jews changed their religious beliefs shortly after Jesus' death. But what is in dispute is how do you explain these things? What is an adequate explanation for what caused these three things? What's the inference to be made, or what's the conclusion to be made from the evidence we have? You have people's lives being changed seemingly overnight after Jesus' death. How do you explain that? Is there any other adequate explanation than Jesus rose from the dead, and they knew it to be true? That's what caused them to change their lives. What's funny is in addition to these indirect evidence or the circumstantial evidence, we also have eyewitness accounts of the crucifixion, the empty tomb, and the resurrected Jesus. So we have direct evidence or eyewitness evidence, and we also have circumstantial evidence. God gave us every kind of piece of evidence we need to come to the conclusion that he raised his son from the dead. God made it clear, and it's the ultimate confirmation, the resurrection is, that Jesus was who he claimed to be. There's a man named Sir Lionel Luckhoo. He's actually a lawyer who's in the Guinness Book of World Records for being the world's most successful lawyer. He had 245 consecutive murder acquittals. This man knows something about evidence, right? For years, he subjected the evidence for the resurrection to his rigorous analysis. And I will give you a quote by him. He said, "I say unequivocally that the evidence for the resurrection is so overwhelming that it compels acceptance by proof, which leaves absolutely no room for doubt." It's an airtight case. The evidence all points to the fact that Jesus was raised from the dead. It best fits the evidence. It's the only adequate explanation for these changes in these people's lives. This monumental shift in religion, the monumental shift in people's lives, going from skeptic to believer, from scared, sad, hopeless, to going around teaching everybody that Jesus was raised from the dead. Jesus rose. It best fits the evidence. At the end of his book, Lee Strobel, after the 2-year investigation to the evidence for the resurrection, said he sat down for a weekend and went over all the evidence he accumulated. And looking at it with an open mind, he came to the conclusion that there's no other explanation. The fact of the matter was that Jesus was resurrected. And then he was confronted with this question: what now? What do I do with it? Now that I know that Jesus has risen from the dead, there's no doubt about it, the evidence all points to that, what do I do with it? Well, he came to the conclusion that he had to believe that Jesus rose, and he converted to Christianity. So what about us? Now that we see the evidence, and we know from the evidence that Jesus was raised from the dead, what's it do for our life? We're all faced with the same question. What do we do with it, right? Jesus rose. Now we have to make a decision. Do we believe it? And believe it to the point that we let it affect our lives like it affected James's life, like it affected Paul's life, like it affected the apostles' life, like it affected the Jews' lives in the first century. This monumental event changed their lives. will it change ours? Tonight, if you're not a Christian, you are to believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that he died for our sins, he was resurrected. You're to confess that belief. You're to repent of your sins, be buried with him in baptism for the remission of your past sins, and walk in newness of life. We can be confident he rose, and we can be confident that our belief is not in vain. As that reading a few minutes ago, if our hope is in Jesus only and he isn't raised from the dead, then we should be pitied because we've based our whole life on something that isn't true. But thank God he gave us plenty of evidence to prove that he did. If you have any need, just come forward while